Many people who think deeply move through life with a quiet doubt about themselves, not because they lack ability, but because their awareness grows faster than their certainty. The more carefully a mind observes the world, the harder it becomes to feel impressed by its own thoughts. What often looks like insecurity from the outside is sometimes a sign of a mind that sees too much to settle for simple confidence. And there is a psychological reason why this pattern appears again and again in people who think at a deeper level. Some people move through conversations and situations with a noticeable restraint. They listen longer than they speak. They pause before responding, not because they are unsure, but because their mind is busy sorting meaning from noise. Silence, for them, is not an empty space that needs to be filled. It is a working space where thoughts are tested before being released. This habit often goes unnoticed or is misunderstood as shyness or detachment, yet internally there is constant activity. Words are treated as something with weight, not something to spend quickly. Speaking only happens when the thought feels accurate enough to stand on its own. This same pattern appears in how they relate to information that others accept easily. When something is presented as obvious or universally agreed upon, their mind quietly slows down instead of nodding along. Not to resist, and not to prove anyone wrong, but to understand what is actually holding the idea together. Questions arise naturally, without effort. Why does this work this way? What assumptions are being made? What would happen if one small part were different? This questioning is rarely visible on the surface, yet it shapes how they understand rules, traditions, and explanations. Agreement without understanding feels incomplete, almost uncomfortable, because clarity matters more than consensus. Over time, this way of thinking trains the mind to notice patterns, repeated behaviors, familiar emotional reactions. Predictable outcomes begin to stand out. Connections form quietly in the background, linking experiences that others see as separate. When something unfolds exactly as expected, it does not feel surprising. It feels consistent. This is often mistaken for intuition, but it is closer to continuous observation. The mind has been collecting signals for a long time. Once these patterns become visible, they are difficult to ignore. Even when rest is needed, the mind continues to notice structure, rhythm, and repetition in people and systems. Because of this sensitivity, inefficiency becomes hard to overlook. When a process is messy or a system is broken, the mind instinctively begins to reorganize it, not because there is an obligation to fix it, but because unresolved structure creates mental tension. Imagining improvements feels almost playful, like solving a puzzle that presented itself without invitation. The satisfaction comes from coherence, from seeing how something could work more smoothly. When these solutions are ignored, frustration may appear, not from ego, but from the gap between what seems obvious internally and what remains unchanged externally. This way of thinking also shapes how information is absorbed. Reading becomes less about finishing pages and more about collecting perspectives. Ideas are gathered not as isolated facts, but as tools for understanding future situations. Different fields begin to overlap in unexpected ways. A concept from history illuminates a present problem. A psychological insight reframes a personal experience. Over time, these mental models quietly influence judgment, making complex situations feel more navigable. The mind becomes flexible, able to shift viewpoints without losing coherence. When challenges appear, thinking does not spiral in circles. Instead, possibilities are stacked, explored, and simplified. Outcomes are imagined early, not to create anxiety, but to reduce it. By the time a decision must be made, much of the uncertainty has already been processed internally. This is why calm often appears during moments that overwhelm others. The chaos has already been visited in thought, and survived there. What looks like overthinking is often preparation disguised as worry. Silence plays a central role in all of this. Quiet moments allow mental clutter to settle and connections to surface. In silence, priorities become clearer and unnecessary noise falls away. This preference for quiet can be misunderstood as distance, but it reflects engagement rather than withdrawal. The mind is not disengaging from the world, it is organizing it. Within this space, insight forms more easily, and direction feels less forced. Alongside this depth comes a strong sense of internal honesty. When something goes wrong, the first place attention turns is inward. Not to assign blame, but to understand contribution. Excuses offer little comfort because they block learning. Gate. Facing mistakes directly may feel uncomfortable, but it shortens the distance between error and adjustment. Growth becomes possible because denial is not used as protection. This honesty keeps standards high, even when no one else is watching. Energy is treated with the same awareness. Focus is reserved for moments when the mind is naturally sharp, and lighter tasks are placed where concentration dips. Productivity is shaped around mental rhythm rather than rigid schedules. This approach preserves clarity and reduces exhaustion. Time feels more flexible when energy is respected instead of forced. Despite all of this complexity, communication often remains simple. Ideas are translated into language that invites understanding rather than admiration. The goal is not to sound intelligent, but to be understood. Adjusting language to the listener reflects awareness, not dilution. Real intelligence often prefers clarity over display, connection over performance. If parts of this felt familiar, it is not because something is missing in you. It may be because your mind operates with a different emphasis. Intelligence does not always appear as confidence or certainty. Sometimes it appears as hesitation, quiet observation, and careful thought. The question is not whether this way of thinking is better or worse. It is how intentionally it is understood and used. What often goes unnoticed is how quietly this kind of mind shapes a life. There is no dramatic display of brilliance, no need to stand apart or announce depth. Much of the work happens internally, invisible to others. Decisions are made with consideration rather than impulse. Reactions are filtered through understanding instead of urgency. This can make progress feel slow on the outside, but internally it is deliberate. Each choice rests on layers of reflection that were never spoken out loud, because this way of thinking does not seek validatio. Time 0.3s, it rarely competes. Comparison feels unnecessary when understanding is the primary goal. Measuring oneself against others offers little useful information, because the focus is on coherence rather than status. What matters is whether thoughts align with reality, whether actions make sense within the larger pattern of life. This is why confidence often looks different here. It is quieter, less certain, and more flexible. It leaves room for being wrong, because being wrong is part of learning. There can be moments when this depth feels isolating. When conversations move quickly or reward simplicity, it may seem easier to stay silent, not because there is nothing to say, but because compressing complex thoughts into fast exchanges feels unsatisfying. This does not mean connection is unimportant. It means connection is valued enough to avoid reducing ideas into something hollow. When understanding is shared slowly and clearly, it carries more weight. Over time, this way of engaging with the world builds a steady internal foundation. External noise loses some of its power. Trends, opinions, and pressure shift constantly, but internal reference points remain. Decisions feel less reactive because they are anchored in reflexio. Time 0.5s, and even uncertainty becomes more tolerable because it is recognized as part of thinking deeply rather than a sign of failure. If you recognized yourself throughout this pattern, it does not mean you are meant to stand above others. It means your mind may be tuned toward observation, integration, and depth. There's nothing broken in that. It is simply a different way of moving through the world. Intelligence does not always look like answers. Sometimes it looks like careful questions, quiet pauses, and a persistent effort to understand rather than impress. And that kind of intelligence rarely draws attention. It shapes life subtly, through patience, clarity, and intention, long before it ever needs to speak for itself.